Okay, so welcome everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started, and I will keep an eye on the waiting room. So thank you so much for being here this afternoon for a conversation with State Representative Matthew Wilson and Malik Brown, who's the Director of LGBTQ Plus Affairs for the City of Atlanta. So I just want to thank everyone for taking the time to be here. I know the message went out a little bit of short notice, so thanks so much for taking your time to join us. This session is being recorded and it will be shared on Oglethorpe social media channels as well as the DEI website. So I'm hopeful that other members of the community will benefit from the conversation as well. We're going to be kind of informal here tonight. Our guests have asked that, our session this evening be sort of informal and conversational. So I have a couple questions to get started. And as questions come up for you, or if you have questions to begin with, feel free to raise your hand. Come off mute, ask your question, or you can also type it in the chat, and I'm happy to read your question for you. Okay, so with that, I'm going to allow our guests to introduce themselves. Please, tell us about yourself, your connection, your history here in Atlanta and in Georgia, and then also tell us about how you got your start in government. So Matthew, I'll ask you to start with that question.
Yeah, so thank you very much, Laura Renee, and thanks for the invitation. I'm very happy to be with y'all as we continue to celebrate Pride Month because it's not over yet. So my name is Matthew Wilson. I am very privileged to be the state representative for House District 80 that covers portions of DeKalb and Fulton counties, and most importantly, it covers Brookhaven, where Oglethorpe University is. So I represent Oglethorpe University in the State House. I'm serving my second term. We have what we call a citizen legislature in Georgia, which means it is technically a part-time legislature. We're not in all year long like Congress is. We just serve about 3 months out of the year, and it starts in January and is usually done by the beginning of April. So when I'm not serving in the legislature, I am a practicing trial lawyer here in Brookhaven. I have my own personal injury practice here, and live here in Brookhaven. I'm originally from Georgia, and you asked how we got our start in government. I got my start in government by running for the State House in 2017, or it was the 2018 election. I started in 2017. And it was just after the 2016 election, which for me was kind of earth-shattering in a lot of ways. And I just kind of came to the realization that I needed to do more, and kind of looked around and realized I was in a position to run for the State House seat, and there wasn't really anyone else kind of stepping up to do it. So I put myself forward, and the great people of House District 80 have sent me to the State House twice so far.
Great, thank you. Malik, that's you.
Yep, thank you. Thank you, Laura Renee, for moderating and hosting this important conversation. Thank you to Oglethorpe for having both of us. My name is Malik Brown. I serve as the Director of LGBTQ Affairs for Mayor Bottoms in the city of Atlanta. I am also a lifelong Atlantan and the son of immigrants. My LGBTQ advocacy really started volunteering for the Human Rights Campaign, and getting to know folks in the local political scene really drove my interest in politics and government. Like Matthew, after the 2016 presidential election, I found myself in a very reflective mode and wanted to get in local politics. I felt very strongly about Mayor Bottoms being elected in that runoff campaign, and so joined her team on the campaign and then eventually in the administration, originally as LGBTQ Affairs Coordinator, and then last fall got promoted to Director of LGBTQ Affairs. Both of these roles have been first-time roles for the city of Atlanta, and the director role has been a first for the South. So, as Andre 3000 from Outkast says, the South has something to say, and in this space, we really tend to lead the way here in the city of Atlanta, and by proxy, Brookhaven.
Great, thank you so much. So before we started the call this evening, you both mentioned that June tends to be a very busy month for the two of you. So I'm just wondering, what your day-to-day looks like in the world of government and the world of LGBTQ advocacy.
Yeah, I'll take it first, Matthew. My day-to-day really changes depending on the day. Like I said, especially at the city of Atlanta, this is such a new function. Having a person who focuses on LGBTQ affairs full time. We are a very large and diverse community. So, one day I could be working on a project related to like HIV/AIDS. Another day I could be working on a project related to trans equality or housing. So it really just depends on the day. But, a lot of our work has been rooted in support for the most vulnerable of the LGBTQ community. So youth, people of color, trans people, non-binary people. And then we've also done a lot in changing like systems because we wanted a lot of our work to be more systemic and live beyond us. Like I said, I have also been involved with HRC for 8 years. I'm on the National Board of Governors for HRC. I was lucky enough to get recruited by the Warnock campaign to serve as the LGBTQ advisor earlier this year. It doesn't even feel like it was this year. And then I also last year served on the Out for Biden National Council of LGBTQ leaders who work to elect President Biden.
Great, thank you, Matthew.
Yeah, and you know what, Laura Renee, I'm not going to invade your space as facilitator, but I am going to poke Malik a little bit. He should talk about the mayor's LGBTQ advisory board because I am very privileged also to be able to serve on that advisory board. And I'll tell you, I think it's one of the amazing gifts that Mayor Bottoms has given the city of Atlanta is in addition to creating this full-time position that's dedicated solely to LGBTQ affairs in the city, and Malik being the director of running that office, they've also recognized, look, we don't have all the answers to this, and the issues are constantly kind of changing. So they've put together this large advisory group that is incredibly representative of a lot of very diverse communities, however you define that word. And we are constantly meeting every month to work on projects and basically there's some great organizational term that I can't think of right now, but basically be able to come up with some great policy ideas to then bubble up to the mayor and her office to kind of implement and have done great work on that. So in addition, Malik also kind of runs that shop. But very quick, I'll answer the question for me too. The day-to-day, I mentioned that our legislature is technically part-time. So we're only in session voting on bills from January to about April. It's 40 legislative days, but not every day of the week is considered a legislative day. So it kind of varies. So at the beginning of the year, my day-to-day is I'm at the Capitol every day and I'm in session. We're reviewing bills. We're trying to get sponsors, people to sign on to bills. We're trying to move stuff. We're trying to fight stuff. I'm strategizing with my colleagues. It's much like how you would expect the legislative session to be. But then once it ends, the job doesn't necessarily end. It is very much a full-time job. I actually, today is a great example. I got 2 calls this morning from constituents who were having issues with their unemployment insurance from the Department of Labor. And one of the things that I'm able to do as a state representative is kind of serve as a liaison between constituents and state government. And so when constituents are having issues with getting a response or just not sure who to go to, a lot of times they call their state rep and say, help me, please. And so I spend a good deal of time when we're not in session just responding to constituent inquiries or doing a lot of events like this where I'm trying to not only stay engaged in the community for my personal political benefit, but also so that I'm making sure that I'm aware of what's going on, what the issues are, what the conversations are.
Great, thank you. So Malik, did you want to follow up with anything about the advisory council?
No, I think Matthew hit it on the head. It's such a great board. We have 43 members. It is a very large board. Sometimes that is hard to manage, but the benefit of it is that we get to accomplish so many incredible things. Thanks to people like Matthew. Matthew is the co-chair of our LGBTQ Youth Committee. So he spends a lot of his time thinking about like anti-bullying measures and like youth roundtables and making sure that youth has a voice within the LGBTQ youth have a voice within the mayor's office. And it's such a incredible board. And Matthew's right, you know, we don't have all the answers, even me as, you know, a person with lived experience. There's so much that the board has opened our eyes to, and just so many incredible connections and hard work. So I can't say enough about how incredible our advisory board is, especially our LGBTQ youth subcommittee.
Great. Well, so we know the pandemic has presented many challenges, particularly for underrepresented communities and minoritized communities. So could you maybe talk a little bit about how the pandemic has affected your work, and you know, what have you done to support LGBTQ communities through the pandemic?
Yeah, and so I'll answer this in two different aspects, my legislator hat and then my lawyer hat, because I think both kind of tell a different story. As far as the legislator hat goes, you know, I started the year in legislative session. We had a very interesting session. Normally, we're all in the House chamber, sitting right next to each other. And one of the things I love about the way we are set up in the Georgia House is we don't say, you know, you hear people say, my friend from across the aisle, or I reach across the aisle to get help on this particular thing. In Congress, they sit, all the Democrats sit together, all the Republicans sit together. So there's this rhetorical aisle, or actually a literal aisle. In the Georgia House, we're all mixed up, not just by parties, but by seniority. I sit on the very back row, next to one of the most veteran Republicans, one of the most powerful chairwomen in the state house. And the speaker kind of does that so that we do kind of have to work together. We get to know each other. I will say I've developed a very strong personal friendship with my seatmate. And so it's hard to kind of, you know, say bad things about her because I know her personally, and that's the point. But during COVID, all that got interrupted, just like all of our other lives did. We were spread out into 3 different places, kind of spread out on the floor, and then some of us were put up in the gallery, and then there was another group that was in a room and kind of video fed in. So it made our jobs very difficult because a lot of legislating is people-to-people interactions, trying to convince someone that a policy is right or of a particular strategy, and getting them to literally sign the bill. You've got to do that face-to-face. And so it made the job very, very difficult. I'll also say just the policy implications, you know, I mean, we could spend a whole podcast talking about that, but that, and then just the nature of my constituent services drastically changed overnight because everybody was calling the legislature about unemployment, about when are we going to go back, about mask mandates. I mean, you name it. And none of us really had a lot of answers because we were kind of working through the issues in real time, just like everybody else in the world. Switching to the lawyer hat, the Georgia courts shut down for a year, and for some legal cases, legal issues, that's not that big of a deal because you don't necessarily need to be at the physical courthouse to get sort of through the system. But for the type of law that I practice, personal injury law, we file lawsuits, we take people to court, and my clients don't get you know, justice until the very end of the case. And often that involves a trial or a lot of court hearings. None of that happened for a year. So there's an incredible backlog of civil cases in our state, you know, kind of behind the backlog of criminal cases that we have, and we're going to be dealing with that for years. But thankfully, so that did give me a little bit more time to pivot to our work with the Mayor's Advisory Council and on LGBTQ issues. And then also in the legislature, I gotta say, every year in the legislature, LGBTQ people are, there is some group, even if it's a small group, who is trying to attack the LGBTQ population in Georgia and trying to use them as a wedge issue for particular bills. This year, it was a little harder for them to do that because of the nature of our session within the pandemic. The leadership of the House and the Senate were much more disciplined about what we could consider. And so some of that bad stuff got taken off the table right away just because we didn't have time to really consider it. So that was kind of an unfortunate upside to all of this.
Thank you. Malik.
Yeah, thank you. I think a lot of people saw the city's response to COVID-19 because oftentimes it played out in the news. If you watched the news any of last year between my boss and our governor. And so, folks had a front row seat to our COVID-19 response. I'll say, the Human Rights Campaign put out a really great report detailing how COVID-19 exacerbated inequities that we found within LGBTQ communities. Laura Renee, like you said at the beginning of your question, it has already negatively affected so many underrepresented communities, and the LGBTQ community is definitely one of them. The data showed, for example, LGBTQ people of color reported having hours cut at work. Trans women reported lower income or being fired at a higher rate during the pandemic. And I want to say, something like 40% of LGBTQ people worked in industries that were devastated by the pandemic. So like your entertainment industry, hospitality, like the gig economy, those sorts of things. So it has been incredibly challenging for the LGBTQ community. And so some of the things that we did in the mayor's office were right away, we put together an LGBTQ COVID-19 resource guide for Atlantans. And it was a ever evolving guide. So, resources around, where economic opportunity, health related resources. We also made sure that we got like PPE in the hands of all of our nonprofits, our nightlife partners. It is no secret that Georgia was very busy during the pandemic. And so, if we didn't have the legal power to stop that, we at least wanted to make sure that we had PPE with all of our nightlife partners. The mayor put out a number of grants. A lot of those grants resonated with the LGBTQ community, especially the ones that I'm thinking around are around like cosmetology and the creative communities. Talked to some folks who were able to secure grants through that. And the last thing that I'll mention is Mayor Bottoms hosted the first ever Atlanta LGBTQ Opportunity Fair. And so that was a job and resource fair that we did virtually last summer. We had over 800 people in attendance and were able to connect many of them to job opportunities and vital resources. And we had like some of Atlanta's foremost employers there providing on-site interviews and hiring. And then the thing that I'm really proud of is we did several webinars leading up to the event around like interview skills, resume writing, how to rock your LinkedIn profile. And then I know as we've all experienced our own internet challenges during the pandemic, we also made sure that there were centers of digital equity set up so that if people didn't have access to stable internet or technology, they could still participate in the opportunity fair.
Thanks. So I want to make sure, if people in attendance have questions, we can transition to that. But I do have one more question before we do that. So Matthew, you had mentioned legislation. And so over the last several years, actually, we've seen a rise in both anti-trans legislation and anti-trans violence. And so I was wondering if the two of you could spend some time reflecting upon that. What do you think is happening, what is going on, and then what are some of the ways that you're responding to this in your particular roles. Maybe Matthew, you could start with that.
Sure. Yeah, we have seen a big rise in anti-trans legislation, not just in Georgia, but across the country. Really, this year, trans students in particular have been the wedge issue across the country. We have been fortunate in Georgia. There were 3 different bills introduced this year that basically targeted trans student athletes to say that they cannot compete in public sports, and if the public sports league allowed them to compete, they would remove the state funding from that league or from the school system. All 3 of those bills died in committee, as we say. There was no action taken in committee to move them out, and part of that was just because of our shortened, more focused session, but a big part of it was because of the fierce advocacy that we had at the state capitol. We have 7 openly LGBTQ legislators. I'm proud to be one of them. We made history the last session, elected the first openly LGBTQ state senator, Kim Jackson, who's also an Episcopal priest. Her voice carries even more gravitas in a lot of ways on these issues of morality and just how we treat one another. And we were able to kind of beat those back. A lot of states weren't. Florida in particular is always a hot mess, but in this year on anti-LGBTQ issues, Florida has just been horrific to watch. I mean, it's been everything from the governor line item vetoing funding for the survivors and the families of the Pulse nightclub shooting, to being so petty as to require the owners of the bridge in Tampa say you cannot do light up in rainbows for Pride Month. The governor tells you have to stop that. I mean, this is just horrific. I mean, I think the worst part of it is it's all just very political and trying to use our community as a wedge issue. And so we've got to fight back against it. We've been successful here in Georgia. And a big part of that is because we have elected more, and every year we have more and more openly LGBTQ people running for office and getting elected, not just in the legislature, but in local office as well. And we have an incredible coalition of equity partners who are ever vigilant about what's going on. And we also have very strong leaders like Mayor Bottoms, for example, who are willing to publicly state when bad bills are bad, you know?
Great, thank you. Malik.
Yeah, thank you. I think Representative Wilson, you live this day in and day out. I think those are incredible overview of like the onslaught of hateful legislation that trans people have seen. The other sort of like dual pandemic of that is anti-trans violence. The Human Rights Campaign has been tracking anti-trans fatal violence since 2013, and it has continued to be on the rise. Both, data from the Human Rights Campaign and the FBI show that fatal anti-trans violence is on the rise. 2020 was the deadliest year on record for trans people. I think nearly close to 50 trans people in the United States were murdered. And unfortunately, 2021, we are already outpacing where we were in 2020. So unless something dramatic changes, we will likely have an even deadlier year on record. And I think the most troubling thing for me and a lot of people is that these fatal acts of violence are committed by intimate partners, whether those are romantic or physical partners. A lot of the murders are stemming from that. And, that tells me personally that is really rooted in stigma. I think as a society, folks who might love or be attracted to a trans person have been so judged, or it's like, oh, you're gay, or whatever it is. There's been negative stigma attached to that. And unfortunately, that has driven people to violence, and oftentimes fatal violence. So I think, it's up to all of us, especially Matthew and I as government officials, to combat that through education. Matthew and I both spend a lot of time thinking about policy and legislation. And this is one that I've been struggling on because we already have like hate crimes on the books. So how do you out policy your way out of this? And I don't really, I have not arrived on a policy solution to this. And it really feels like more of a destigmatization, education type deal. And then also just making sure that trans people have more access to opportunities and resources, so they might not even find themselves in these situations in the first place.
And I'll jump in, just add a quick coda to this too, that these are violent acts that are happening in our neighborhoods. In Brookhaven earlier this year, Sophie Vasquez, 36-year-old woman, was murdered in her apartment complex. Malik and I attended a vigil there just a couple of months ago. So far, three trans women have been murdered in Georgia so far this year, in Atlanta, in Brookhaven, in Albany. And you obviously, anytime anyone is murdered, it's a sad occurrence. But you think, well, 3 people, it's not really that many people. But when you think about it from the terms of their community, the LGBTQ population is a very small chunk of the entire state of Georgia, right? It's anywhere from 10 to 15% at any given time. And then you think about the trans community within the LGBTQ community. It's a much smaller community. And then we talk about trans women of color, and it just gets smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. So 3 people out of that community, it is a disproportionate amount of that community. If 25% of Georgians were murdered in a year, we would be outraged and call it an epidemic. And the CDC has called this an epidemic of violence against trans women. But the point I want to make is that it is happening in our neighborhoods.
Thank you for that. Okay, so I'll turn it to our attendees and see if there are any questions from the group. Rebecca.
Oh, thank you so much, both Malik and Matthew, for being here. So I'm curious to know about your efforts or successful efforts you've seen to build allyship. So I know you've talked a lot about, having more openly LGBTQ representatives does a lot, but of course for many it's about building allies. So what are some of the successful ally efforts you've seen, and what would be some of those recommendations you think that we as Oglethorpe could implement to help build our allies for both of our students, but faculty and staff?
It's a great question. And, it's one of those things that I certainly don't have the perfect answer to, but I'll tell you just from my experience. I think that's something that just as a society, we've all got to work on more, is building space for allies. It's important that we claim our individual identities and wave all our pride flags, whatever your pride flag looks like. But it's also important that we understand that we need each other, right? We need each other, especially the LGBTQ community. We need each other, and we need allies because we're very small in number. In the legislature in particular, I mentioned we only have 7 openly LGBTQ legislators out of 236 total in the State House and the State Senate. We have built allies just through the old-fashioned way, just having conversations. Part of it is what we're doing here tonight is things that increase visibility and person-to-person interaction, even if it's virtual, about LGBTQ issues, and just getting people familiar with talking openly, saying the acronym LGBTQ, understanding why we post our pronouns, and just giving people space to try that out in a safe space where we're not going to, put them on blast for getting it wrong. It's not about calling people out for getting the nomenclature wrong or whatever, or not approaching something the right way. It's truly about just the human to human interaction and learning experiences. And so I think anything we can do to increase that, these things are part of it. Creating a vice president's position for diversity and inclusion. That is huge. That is an incredible institutional action that moves the movement forward for everybody, but certainly the LGBTQ community.
Yeah, and the only thing that was incredible, the only thing I'll add is especially when you're looking at government officials and elected officials and even candidates, just make sure you're having these conversations, especially here in Atlanta. Like, no one should be running for office if they can't tell you how they plan to address, violence against trans women, or how they plan on, contributing to the reduction of our epidemic level HIV rates. So I think just holding our elected officials accountable and ensuring that we're not voting for folks unless they can tell you what their plan is. The other thing that I would say, especially in the LGBTQ community, especially as folks get younger and younger and we get older and older, terminology just changes. And there have been times where people have been, and it's my job to work in this issue, but there have been times where people will say terminology. I'm just like, can you break this down for me? So making sure that you are listening to folks, just knowing that terminology is going to change, believing them when they tell you that they identify in a certain way. And then, I think Matthew said, just being vulnerable enough to ask questions if you don't understand. I used to use the terms non-binary and gender non-conforming interchangeably until someone shared that those are not interchangeable terms. Non-binary means that you don't identify within any gender binary, and gender non-conforming means that you generally do identify as either a man or a woman, but it might be your appearance that is different. So you might actually identify as a binary, but your clothes might be more fluid, and it's just your presentation. So, even just being able to learn and ask vulnerable questions when you can.
And Rebecca, Malik always does this. He says fantastic comments, and it makes me think of something else. But one other thing I thought of is also it's incumbent upon us to make specific asks of our allies, of our friends who want to be allies, and say, hey, here's something you can do for me to be, and I say that because all through the Black Lives Matter movement, I want to be an ally. I don't necessarily, as a gay white man who's a lawyer in Brookhaven and lives a privileged life, I don't necessarily know what that means or looks like, other than showing up for a march, for a protest, and holding a sign. But I also know that that's like 30 minutes of a movement. What else can I do? And so I've tried to be more explicit about asking, hey, what can I do? What can I do to be an ally, to fill this space? But it dawns on me that within the LGBTQ community, we can also be better about being explicit with our allies of, hey, can you do this? Can you show up at this event for me? Can you help me promote this? Can you put in a good word? Or so-and-so keeps using the wrong pronouns for me. I don't want to make it awkward. Can you just maybe pull them aside and say something? Things like that.
Eli.
Thank y'all for both talking to us tonight. This has been great. I was wondering if y'all could talk about your educational journey, like, where you went to school, what you maybe studied, how that affected, what you went into, or maybe not, maybe you went a completely different way than your undergraduate or any advanced work. Do y'all mind talking about that for a minute?
Malik, you go first.
Yep. So I started my educational journey here in APS. If you realize, or if you know folks in the Atlanta political scene, it is very, like most of the times people actually ask where you graduated from high school as opposed to where you graduated from college, because Atlanta politics is very big on APS. I unfortunately got moved to the suburbs in high school, so I did not get that APS graduation experience. I'm still bitter about it, although I loved growing up in the suburbs. Came to the city, went to Georgia State, studied communications. I'll be transparent with y'all. My sophomore year of college, I came upon some pretty chronic health challenges. And it was at the same time that my grandma was in, it was very apparent she was in her last few years of life. So I did not finish my college career. It's actually, spoiler alert, something that I'm looking into finishing now. But communications is what I went for. And it's funny because now I write a ton of speeches, a ton of scripts, a ton of social media content, email, you name it. So I still get to put those skills to use.
Thanks.
Yeah, so I grew up outside of Atlanta. I grew up in Griffin, which is about an hour and a half south of down 75 from Brookhaven, down 85, I guess I should say. I went to UGA for college, and I have to say I was not excited about going to UGA, having grown up in Georgia, and you know, considering myself a Georgia boy, but still did not want to go to UGA for college. I wanted to go out of state. My dream school was Georgetown, and I did not get in, and it really kind of crushed me. But I went to UGA, and I think part of the reason I didn't want to go to UGA was because I was very much starting my journey of figuring out who I was and coming out, which took a very long time. But I think I just subconsciously wanted space to do that. UGA was an amazing experience for me though, and I could not have asked for a better college experience. I was very involved in sort of the student programming, student organization space. Athletics was not really my thing, but Malik, I also majored in communications, but here's the twist. It was agricultural communications. It is kind of a hybrid degree at UGA in the College of Ag. That is it's actually kind of like an ag journalism degree is what it is. But I was there on a 4-H scholarship and needed to be in the College of Ag to keep the 4-H scholarship, and knew that I wanted to go to law school. And you know it doesn't matter what you major in undergrad. And so I said, well, ag communications it will allow me to work on my writing. I can take writing classes, you know, and so that's what I did. Had no intent of ever being an ag journalist, but journalism very much sort of fascinated me, and I learned a lot. I worked for 5 years before I went back for law school. I did a program called Teach for America for 3 years. I taught middle school 6th grade math and science in Houston, Texas, right after Hurricane Katrina. So actually a lot of my students were from New Orleans, which was, you know, I mean, you know, all of you working on a university campus know this, but students have a way of just sort of grounding you and teaching you a lot of life lessons, especially when they're in 6th grade. They're like wise beyond their years. And then I came back, moved back to Georgia, and went to UGA for law school, and you know, still practice law. But I'm very grateful for that experience. I did not come out until after law school. I was 30, and it just took me a very long process. But part of that was because growing up in Griffin, not the smallest town in Georgia, but certainly not Atlanta. I was not exposed to anyone from the LGBTQ community until I was on campus at UGA, and it took me a long time, just I think, for my brain to understand what it meant to be gay, and to see people living an out life, and even within the faculty and within campus life. That was really sort of just mind blowing for me, but very much helped in kind of my social development. So I'm very grateful for all my time at UGA. Go Dogs.
Great, thanks, Matthew. Marissa, you have a question.
So you highlighted a couple of things, both of you, in your previous answers that were leading into my question about youth. So I have a 12-year-old, and I'm learning a lot from my 12-year-old. I've had a lot of conversations that I wasn't necessarily expecting with a 12-year-old. And so you're highlighting, or you've already mentioned how youth have changed, right? The terms that are being used, the conversations that are being had, the representation that exists that didn't exist before. And so I'm really interested to hear more about how you both connect with youth and what you do with regards to outreach, and in particular, how you as a representative of government and promoting civic engagement. So how you're connecting youth, whether it's K through 12 or higher ed, to being aware and being engaged civically.
Matthew, do you want to? We always do this where do you want to go first? You especially? No? Okay. So, really being in the mayor's office, if you know Mayor Bottoms, or if you've just seen her, she is really passionate about youth. She has 4 teenagers of her own. And so our work often intersects, whether it's even just work around like the Water Boys, or, her Higher Atlanta youth program. Youth is very much a focal point of our administration. Within our LGBTQ Affairs program, we have really spent a lot of time convening youth serving leaders. One of the things, I'm probably at 3.5 years in this role. And so one of the first things that we did was start convening a ton of LGBTQ youth serving nonprofits. And the thing that was kind of a shock to me within one of our first meetings is, them saying, wow, we've really never been in the same room. And you would think, I think us as adults all now know that folks are often so siloed, and we're so focused on, rightfully so to some degree, the work that we're doing, but sometimes fail to be as collaborative as we could. And so we've spent a lot of time really bringing together youth serving professionals. My journey was a little different than Matthew's. I came out when I was 14. I think, Matthew, my gayness might be a little harder to hide than yours. If you can see all the rainbows and stuff behind me, but it was very difficult to keep the secret past 14. So it may have just been more of a survival thing than it actually me wanting to come out. But I do remember what it feels like having those conversations in my teen years. And so, as we've, had roundtables with youth and things like that, it's been really moving for me. And it's also been a really helpful reminder. The mayor has a ton of roundtables with various communities. And so when we had one with young Black and Latinx boys, it wasn't specific to the LGBTQ community, but some of the youth did feel comfortable coming out to us. It was just a really powerful reminder. They didn't even realize, that the city of Atlanta had a function like that roles like ours existed. And it was just incredibly powerful. And Matthew, who co-chairs our LGBTQ Youth Committee, can talk about some of those initiatives. I don't want to steal your thunder, but there's some good work underway to, even as we approach a transition of the administration, to make sure that the voices of LGBTQ youth are amplified and included.
Yeah, so from issue perspective, one of the main issues I've focused on in the State House is banning conversion therapy in Georgia. And I've done a lot of work on the Mayor's Advisory Board in that space as well. So I've been working a lot with groups who work with youth, in particular mental health professionals who work with youth. I'll say, as far as my direct involvement with youth, I have to really go out of my way to keep those kind of connections, because it's much harder in my day-to-day job, because I'm just constantly interacting with adults who aren't the worst group, but we have constituents in all ages, right? I hated during the pandemic. I'm in my third year as a state representative, and the first year in 2019, it was very fun, because I was always getting invited to schools to come read to a class, for example, like a pre-K class or whatever, or just come because they wanted to talk about social studies, for example. They want to do a civics lesson, and a lot of my friends are teachers, and so I get invited a lot to come and speak to their classes. And I don't know if I mentioned this, I grew up in the Georgia 4-H program, which is a youth development program, and a number of my friends that I grew up with now are leaders within the statewide organization. And so I get invited to 4-H events to speak to 4-H youth a lot. And the first year I was doing a lot of those programs and really kind of interacting with kids. And during the legislative session, every day there are school groups or 4-H groups, or you name it, FFA groups, Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, who come to the Capitol. There are always kids at the Capitol during the session. But then we had a whole year where that didn't happen, and I'm 2 years now, really, as far as the legislative session goes, where I haven't sort of had that. So I'm just like everybody else, looking forward to returning to normal, so that I can sort of get those pathways open back up again.
I think one thing, Matthew, you'll learn about him, is very gracious and very humble. One of the things that Matthew has really been a leader on, alongside Mayor Bottoms and the advisory board, is our anti-bullying efforts. And so I talk a lot about, I'm new to government. This is my third year, if you didn't remember from like 3 minutes ago, the last time I mentioned that. But being so new, it shocks me sometimes when you would think that programs or policies are on the books and they're not. But the city of Atlanta didn't really, before Mayor Bottoms, didn't really have a huge anti-bullying policy. There weren't trainings, those sorts of things. And so under the leadership of Mayor Bottoms and Matthew, we are in the process of standing that up. We're partnering with Georgia State, making sure that we get all of our youth-facing staff trained, and then ultimately our youth trained on anti-bullying. And then also making sure that we set up, measures for prevention, whistleblower protection, and just protections for people, so that they know that they can report bullying in any form, including anti-LGBTQ bullying, to the city, and that they will be in a safe space to do so.
Okay, Eli, I see your hand, but I did receive a question in the chat that I want to be sure to get to you. So it is from Oslim, and I sincerely apologize if I didn't pronounce that correctly. But they say, thank you so much for being here and for your work. And they have a question that is related to participation. So they say, how was the response from the community when the city announced the formation of the LGBTQ advisory board? Can anybody who wants to volunteer in the board join? Or is there a selection process, and how is it all working?
Whew, that is $1 million question. So we are in sort of the second iteration of the mayor's LGBTQ advisory board. So the first time, within the first couple of weeks in office, Mayor Bottoms was very clear that she wanted this type of board. So she tasked myself, and then one of my dear colleagues, Rashad Taylor, who's openly gay, he is the mayor's senior advisor. She tasked us with putting together a list of recommendations for advisory boards. So I give you that context to say that the first iteration of the advisory board was, I think, like 99% appointments. The second iteration, we realized to their point that it needed to be much more community involved. So we opened up the advisory board for applications. So if you're not following the City of Atlanta LGBTQ Affairs program across social media, please do. It's me updating it, so I'm a little biased, but I think we do a good job of communicating with the community. So I say that to say that we shared that the advisory board was open to applications. I think we got something like either 200 or 300 applications, which is incredible. And I'll tell you, you never know in government. I didn't know if people were just gonna like jokingly apply or they were gonna, not have like sort of any experience. And you need all levels of experience, right? You need sort of newer people and more distinguished people. But these were like hundreds of incredibly qualified people. I love my job. The selections process for this class of the LGBTQ Advisory Board was one of the hardest things I've ever done over the last 3 years. And it's why the board grew from 35 to 43, because we just could not condense it down. So I say all that to say it was very competitive. Matthew made the cut. Congratulations. It was a very competitive process. But that just makes me really proud that there are so many people who are passionate about these issues and want to serve this city. To the point around volunteering, that is not one of the things that we've really perfected just yet. So we do oftentimes have subject matter experts who come in, and it usually is around like health or youth. So if folks, or even the arts, because we have an arts, entertainment, and culture subcommittee, oftentimes people will come in as subject matter experts and work with a committee on a certain project. As our administration changes, we definitely will recommend that to the next administration, doing a little bit more digging into the volunteer piece. But right now it's much more of a ad hoc project specific volunteering. Matthew, do you have anything to add?
No, I'll just say as far as, different various ways to get plugged in to LGBTQ advocacy in particular in the region, two of the best ones to go to are, number one, Malik's office, the LGBTQ, no, I'm serious, the LGBTQ Affairs office, because it's housed in the office of the mayor of Atlanta, one of the most powerful mayor offices in the country. Malik knows what's going on at all times, I can guarantee you. But the other group I would encourage all of you, if you're not already plugged into, is Georgia Equality, which has been doing this work for decades and decades here in Georgia. And in particular, whenever there are government programs or opportunities to volunteer or serve or grant programs and things like that, where there are government agencies trying to get connected to either LGBTQ folks who could benefit or people who kind of serve the LGBTQ community, including allies. Georgia Equality is constantly sort of promoting those things. And so it's another good clearinghouse of just ways to get involved.
Great, thank you. Eli.
I was just gonna ask if y'all would, I don't know, say something about kind of looking forward, like in the city, we're gonna have a new mayor very soon. And then at the state level, with Senator Warnock being up for re-election next year, it's probably gonna be a crazy election cycle here in the state of Georgia as well. So like from both of your perspectives of kind of looking forward at the state level and then also the city level, just maybe some thoughts on this.
Yeah, if you know anything about me, I have a lot of opinions. I don't think my ethics office would appreciate if I gave you any opinions on city candidates, but what I will say is make sure you have the tough conversations. I have seen for 4 years, my boss, you've all seen her go through incredibly tough conversations. And it just, to me, matters most that elected officials are able to, one, answer the tough questions, and two, be held accountable. So as you're looking at, who you would like to support for the next mayor or the next city council members, make sure that, they're having these tough conversations. I'll say this city council, this slate of city council members has been incredibly supportive and engaged on LGBTQ affairs. And so really thinking through, if who is coming next and making sure that you are holding them accountable. I'll say we're in this interesting period where, we have been doing this incredible work for almost 4 years now, and we just don't know what the next mayor's level of engagement is going to be like. Some mayors will continue a liaison position and, they'll show up to galas, but we're really hoping that the next mayor will, be just as out front on these issues as Mayor Bottoms. And so we're doing everything we can. I can't give away all of our secrets yet, but we're doing everything that we can to make sure that this work lives beyond us. But I do think a part of that is going to be the next mayor and city council and holding them accountable during the election process.
Yeah, and Eli, that's a great question. We have so this year, this November is a municipal election year. No matter where you live in the metro area, or even if you live outside the metro area, there are municipal races, city races, county government races that are happening. And in particular, I think the pandemic has really illustrated for just the average person who might not be as plugged into government as those of us here, how critical local government officials are, and how much influence they have. And if you don't believe me, I mean, look at all of the money, the billions and billions and billions of dollars that the mayors and city councils and county commissioners in Georgia are going to be spending over the next year. And those are on projects that we care about, that are taking place on your campus or where in your backyard where you live. And so it is a great opportunity right now to take a look in your community, wherever you live, at the municipal races to see who's running, what's going on, ask them about the issues that you care about, and make sure that you get an answer about it. And to the extent that your students are interested in politics, now's a great time to volunteer for campaigns. And you can give as little time or as much time as you want. This is all a prelude, and Eli, you kind of teed this up for me perfectly, so thank you. To next year, 2022 is going to be a huge year for the state, because every statewide elected position, and there are 8 of them, 8 of them, plus every member of the legislature, the state house and the state senate, 236 of them, are all up for re-election next year. And as Eli mentioned, Senator Warnock, his seat is up for the regular election as well. So it is going to be an incredible year. We have a great opportunity next year, I think, to really kind of move Georgia forward and elect a whole slate of progressive officials who are going to not only not use LGBTQ Georgians as a wedge issue, but are actually going to look out for our interests. I actually 2 months ago announced my campaign for statewide insurance commissioner. And I'm not going to turn this into a campaign commercial, but I will say that I'm proud to bring LGBTQ representation to the statewide ticket. And when I'm elected next year, I'll be the first openly LGBTQ person elected statewide in Georgia, and the first openly LGBTQ constitutional officer elected in the whole South. I mean, we have a lot of history that we can make next year as we choose who our leaders are going to be, and moving LGBTQ representation forward is certainly part of that. So now is the time, though, to get involved, in these local races that are going to be happening this November.
All right, thank you. Well, I know we're at time. I have just one last question for you, but before I give you the last word, I just wanted to say thank you so much to both of you for being here tonight. And we would love to have you back outside of Pride Month, because this is definitely a conversation we will continue here at Oglethorpe, and I would love to have you be involved in that. So, so to close out, I'd like to just ask you, today is the last day of National Pride Month, and maybe you can just reflect a little bit on what Pride means to you. Yeah, Malik, you can start.
Sorry. Thank you. Pride Month to me is so much, but like as you just said, you know, I really think in terms of Pride 365, and you know, just talking and having these important conversations every day. When I think about Pride, I really think about the pioneers, many of whom aren't here with us anymore, but the people who opened the door, you know, the Bayard Rustins and the Audre Lordes and the James Baldwins, and you know, the Miss Major Griffin Gracie, Sylvia Rivera. There's a list of our elders and ancestors that really made it possible for two men like Matthew and I to be in government. So I really think about them. You know, the first Pride did start as a riot and a response to police brutality and injustice. And so I think it's incumbent upon us to continue telling the stories of those people who came before us and who just made it possible for us to even be having a conversation like this today.
You're here. That was perfect, Malik. And you know, to me, Pride is a celebration. It is important that we celebrate the progress that we've made, and in particular in the South and here in Georgia, we have made progress, and it has been very hard fought. And as Malik said, by people who have come generations before us. It is important that we fill that space and celebrate those accomplishments, and provide visibility to that fight. And so Pride Month is an important part of that. But Pride itself, I think also to me, is very much about protest. You know, we have Pride Month in June because that's when the Stonewall riot occurred, and you know, kind of viewed as the sort of the Kickstarter of the gay rights movement. And so Pride itself is rooted in protest, and it's important. And to me, when I think of that word protest, you know, well, what is that in the action of protest? What does that look like? I think it's recommitting ourselves to the fight, because we celebrate how far we've come, but know that there's still a incredible long path for us. And we are the ones who have to do it. All of us, regardless of whether we're LGBTQ or not, we have to recommit ourselves to understanding that this fight is another year-long struggle that we've got to be smart and strategic about, and just gracious with one another. So celebrate and protest. Happy Pride.
That was awesome. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, Malik and Matthew, and thank you to everyone for attending.
Thank you all
Thanks,
very much.
everyone.
Those stormy petrels.
Thank you.
Have a great night, y'all.